Hi, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful live stream I have with the great Zoe Gardner. Thanks so much for coming on, Zoe, at the very last moment. And thanks for bearing with me with some technical issues. How are you this evening?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you on. I just wanted to let the viewers listen to this clip that I thought was really interesting. It's where you're on LBC and there was another commentator on LBC who was talking about shooting people who broke into an airbase, into a military base. So I know it's a bit difficult. You're not able to hear it, but what we'll do is I'll play it for the audience, and then I'll come back to you in just a moment. Okay.
It is not their intention to intimidate or to damage national security. It is their intention to prevent war crimes from taking place, which are taking place. They knew they were committing criminal damage. They knew they were committing vandalism, and they should be charged under those terms. The idea that they are terrorists and that I, now for expressing my support for them, could face serious terrorist charges, up to 14 years in jail, is a terrifying escalation and abuse of state power, and we should not stand for it for a second.
I don't think they are terrorists. I do think they're wankers. I mean, just, you know...
That's totally fine, but this is a serious matter.
I grew up 3 miles away from RAF Royce Norton. If you were stupid enough to try and hop the fence, you would have expected to be shot by the security guards. And I think there's quite a lot of people wondering why the hell that didn't happen this time. I mean, they broke into a high security...
Are you advocating that they should have been shot?
It's a military installation guarded by armed soldiers.
Are you advocating that they should have been shot?
There's quite a lot of...
What is this? What kind of conversation are we in? We should be shooting protesters on site.
Okay, so the other commentator who was on that show on LBC said that people who broke into the airbase should be shot. Your reaction to that was pretty shocking. Well, you were pretty shocked with those comments. What was your feeling? So you were in the studio. How did you feel while this guy was saying these things?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty amazing because, I mean, when he started out, I thought he was trying to make a point about the security perimeter of these kind of sites. And I think, you know, I mean, it's not really a political priority of mine, but I think it's a fair enough point to make that it's a concern if these places are not well guarded and if anybody can make their way in. So this was about the Palestine Action protesters who went in and damaged some RAF jets in one of these places. So I thought he was going to make that point. I was going to let him make it. You know, you'd expect to be shot. Okay, he's going quite extreme with the language, but he's making a wider point about the security. But then he moved on to, and I think a lot of people in this country would be thinking, why weren't they shot? And then that really worried me because that's a rhetorical device we all use to sort of justify and make the positions that we're putting forward sound mainstream and not at all extreme. And I still thought, right, I'm gonna challenge this. Obviously, I'm gonna challenge this. I'm gonna say you're not advocating people should be shot, are you? And I immediately, like, my feeling was he was going to say, no, of course not. All I'm saying is blah. But
he didn't.
And that's when I was really, that's when I said, so hang on a second, what are you advocating for here? And he had every opportunity, you know, to use that rhetorical device and to pivot to the point he wanted to make. But it turns out the point he actually wanted to make was that people should expect to be shot when they're going about acts of protest like this. And I was just, I thought it was horrifying, and I thought it was so emblematic of the sort of disjoint from reality that we're having here. And we're talking about peaceful protesters who used paint to undertake, you know, criminal damage, let's say. And then you know, they're being charged as terrorists, and then we're talking about people who are saying like we should be shooting people on site without trial, extrajudicial killings. That's all cool, and they're the ones arguing for a hard line against terrorism. The world is upside down.
Like I'm just thinking, like a few years ago, if we had these types of conversations, most people, as you said, would have pivoted to look. Yes, you know, if they enter, there's a risk of them being shot But of course, we would hope that wouldn't happen. But it seems that there's no limit anymore. People will just say whatever they want. Like I was thinking about about a year ago, I think it was Ben Habib who was talking about, you know, your area of expertise about refugees and asylum seekers, where he was talking about, well, if they drown in the sea, I don't care, or he'd let them drown. And, you know, it's shocking that this is the sort of language you'd hear behind closed doors at a BNP meeting, you know, 20 years ago. But now it's mainstream. Like, how do we push back on stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one thing is to definitely never accept it as normal. I mean, what the challenge is there, of course, that like we need to push back against that kind of language, that kind of framing, that kind of extreme language that we're getting. But we also need to avoid giving people attention when they are using extreme language simply for the purpose of getting attention. And it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference, but I think, you know, when it's part of an interview and people are talking in, then it's important to push back. Whereas if it's just a tweet where someone says something disgusting, then often it's best to like not limit the amount of oxygen it gets. So it's a judgment call. So I think that's one side of it. But the other side is, you know, they've achieved this over time. And, you know, I remember way back when I was much younger and at the start of my career, and I was asked to comment in the media, and I was very surprised, you know, because David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, had referred to migrants who were attempting to cross to the UK from Calais as a swarm of people. And this was considered like, you know, a big enough deal that we're going to go out and get an advocate for migrants' rights to comment on it and what that use of language means. And we have strayed so far along that path, but it has been step by step by step. And I think what we need to empower to fight back against this is the outriders on our side. And we need to have a lot of solidarity among ourselves as progressives, say, even when people are saying things that we necessarily wouldn't say, that are pushing the envelope, if they're pushing the envelope in the direction of a better conversation, then we need to be supportive of one another, or at least not shutting each other down, because it's only by having that outrider effect that you pull the center towards the direction that you want to pull it in. And unfortunately, we have had the center pulled a very long way to the right at the current time.
Yeah, like I even hear Labour MPs and people who would identify with as being on the left talking about illegal migrants. This is something that really grinds my gears, where we constantly hear politician after politician talking about describing asylum seekers as illegal migrants. Could you explain the difference, just for, I know most people on the stream would probably understand, but if there's anyone who doesn't really understand the difference between an asylum seeker, maybe a refugee, and an economic migrant, because they're all put into one box or in one basket. And of course, the far right, especially as we're seeing the rise of Reform UK, are happy to allow misinformation to filter through so that the public don't know the difference.
Yeah. And it does get complicated, is the honest truth. So, yeah, I mean, obviously a migrant is just a person who moves. So that can be a person who moves because they're forced from their home, or it can be a person who moves just for adventure or for work or for all sorts of different reasons. So migrant covers everybody who moves. Then within that, a refugee specifically is a legal category of person. It means somebody who has left their country of origin because they have a well-founded fear of persecution, and that persecution has to be on certain grounds. So it's really a quite like closely defined category of person. But anybody who has left their country of origin because of that real fear is a refugee. You don't need to be recognized by any government. You don't need to have made any type of journey. You don't have to have applied for any visa. You are a refugee if you have left your country of origin because of that fear of persecution. And I think it's worth also emphasizing that, like, we imagine mainly refugees, we think of people who have fled from war, and that is a big category of them, but persecution can be individualized as well. So there are lots of refugees who come from countries that are not at war, where the general population may be safe, but they individually, because of different circumstances, maybe they're a political activist in somewhere like Turkey, or a journalist who writes critical articles about the government in a place like Turkey. People under those circumstances face being disappeared by the government, being locked up, being imprisoned on trumped up charges, and facing torture and so on. So even though the majority of people in Turkey are safe and Turkey is not a country at war, certain people can still be refugees who have fled from a real fear of persecution because of the weak human rights protection in a country like that. An asylum seeker is somebody who arrives in a country and says they are a refugee, says, please don't send me back because I have fled from a fear of persecution. So that is a temporary category of person, and basically anybody who arrives in the UK on a small boat would fall into that category. All of them present themselves to the authorities, say, I'm a refugee, please don't send me back. And what happens then is that we give them paperwork as an asylum seeker. They are documented. That means they are not an illegal migrant. They are not in the country without authorization. They are authorized to be here for the duration of their asylum claim. And it takes us a disgustingly long amount of time to process.
Why is it taking so long? Because I remember Robert Jenrick, when he was in charge, he decided not to process asylum claims, claiming that it would create a pull factor, which doesn't make any sense. So, but generally, because I heard stories about people. I just want to inform people this is a live stream, so you're watching this live, and I'm here with the wonderful Zoe Gardner. I've heard stories of people waiting up to 10 years or even more for their asylum claim. Why does it take so long?
Yeah, well, those are the extreme cases, but they absolutely do happen. The average is about 2 years, which is still an insanely long time. So what you're trying to actually establish when you have somebody claiming asylum, as I described, the definition of a refugee is really quite boxed off, right? You have to have fled persecution. It has to be for these reasons. And in some cases, you'll have all the documentation that proves, you were a journalist. Let's stick with the example of a journalist in Turkey. You might have articles you've written that are critical of the government. You might have articles that have been written about your situation when you were targeted. You might have the written testimonies of other people around you who can say, yeah, they came and knocked on our door and he had to run, that kind of thing. So in some cases, it's fairly easy to document what's happened to you. In other cases, you have nothing at all, right? You've had to run. You've been targeted, people from Afghanistan, for example, rural areas of Afghanistan, young boys, the Taliban militias go door to door and they try to just grab them and recruit them to the Taliban by force. And a lot of those people will try to escape. Those people will never have had a passport, a birth certificate. They live in countries where that just isn't the norm.
But also even in Britain and in Ireland, many people don't have passports. So
absolutely, yeah. And so in those cases, they have to evidence who they are and what they've fled from in other ways. So you have to do things like linguistic analysis to establish not just where you're from, but which region of the country you might be from. You have to collect testimonies. You might have to go back. You might have to find paperwork. You might have to get an expert legal report about the conditions in the area you've come from. You might have to get a medical report that reports on the scars you have from any torture or violence that you have experienced. So all of that forms the basis of your case. And that takes some time to collect, and it takes some time, reasonably speaking, for the government to process and examine those cases. So on the one hand, there's a reason why it takes some time to process asylum claims. There is no reason why it should be taking on average 2 years, and there's certainly no reason at all why it's taking for some people 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And the reason for that is that basically, the resources in the Home Office are not sufficient to deal with these cases in a timely way. And so what they've been doing, especially lately, is they've been trying to get the backlog down that happened when the Tories were in charge and they said, oh, we just won't process claims and that will solve everything. What they've been doing in order to try to get the backlog down is issuing a lot of very quick decisions. And the problem is they're not issuing the quick decisions on the obvious cases of protection. Places like Syria, places like Sudan, where almost everybody who comes here is definitely a refugee. They're instead issuing fast decisions on cases where it's more, those edge cases I was talking about, where one individual person might have faced danger, but it's more difficult to evidence that. And so they're issuing bad decisions. They're issuing refusals at a much higher rate now. And what happens? Well, those people, they go to appeal. And the appeal process is now having a backlog just like the initial process had under the Tories. And the appeal process takes even longer and takes even more resources. It's the most idiotic system in the entire world. And all this time, people are kept out of the labor market. They are kept away from their families.
Yes, that's a point I wanted to raise as well about, of course, asylum seekers are not allowed to work. What is the motivation behind that? Because it doesn't make any sense to me. It's probably a political decision, obviously, but we keep hearing about, and Talk TV and LBC, and even LBC, which is emulating a lot of GB News sort of rubbish. But you can constantly hear about comment, you have these people in these 5-star hotels. Obviously, they're not 5-star hotels. None of these people have ever actually stayed in these so-called because they're no longer hotels when asylum seekers are moved in. But they're staying in the hotels. They're getting free food, getting free TV, free free phone, free. And I push back on all of these things. But it's if they were permitted to work, then obviously there wouldn't be a cost, or there'd be much less of a cost. So I believe it's a political decision. What's your opinion on that? What's the motivation for not allowing asylum seekers to work?
It's definitely a political decision. So there's a coalition group called Lift the Ban, which is a bunch of different refugee rights organizations, and they've done some research into what the economic impact of allowing asylum seekers to work would be. And it's not just that they would then be able to pay for themselves, it's that they would actually be a net gain to the economy and to the treasury. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's, £100 million or something annually. Obviously, which isn't surprising at all, because you have people from all different walks of life with different kinds of skills who could be doing work that then could contribute to taxation. We have reached an idiotic point in our politics. And actually, we've been here for a little while, but we've been for a while in a position where the accepted wisdom on the part of politicians is that we need deterrence. If we are harsh towards asylum seekers, then they won't come. This has been the approach for 35 years. It's not been super successful.
No.
But the problem is...
But maybe they just need to try it again. Keep trying it, 14, 15 times. And
this sort of assumption that people know what the asylum system is. Either the people trying to come here, definitely they don't. And secondly, the public, right? The public don't know that asylum seekers, for example, are barred from working. So you can't then announce. So back, it was Tony Blair who banned them from working, and he banned them from accessing mainstream benefits and so on, right? But now you're still caught in this narrative that doing anything positive that would help people in these circumstances is a big no-no. And so you have to do harsh things. But you've already done so many of the really, really harsh things that put people in difficult circumstances. And the public just doesn't know about them, which for obvious reasons, totally undermines the argument from political side for doing them, right? Because the political argument is that this signals that you're taking this seriously and that you're getting rid of these people. And essentially, it's been an utter failure. But politicians are now so stuck in that mentality, they believe that they would be, eaten for breakfast if they announced anything that sounded like giving asylum seekers greater rights. Even though, again, the Lift the Ban Coalition has done loads of polling on this, and 75% of the population agrees that asylum seekers should have the right to work. In fact, you can probably bring that higher if you say not the right to work, but they should have the responsibility to work.
They have to work.
They should have to work and pay their way if they are able. We'd get everybody, because people can see that this is absurd, but we're in such a doom loop, and people do believe that it would be a pull factor. Now, the reason why I don't believe it would be a pull factor is that, number one, people don't know that they're not going to be entitled to work for years. So it can't be a pull factor if they don't know that it's going to happen. But also across the rest of Europe, you have easier rights to work as asylum seekers. Now, they're not perfect, and you still have some limitations, but essentially it is legal to work much sooner as an asylum seeker in every other country in Europe than it is in the UK. So it doesn't make any sense if the right to work would be such a pull factor, then why would people be coming from France, where they have the right to work, to the UK where they don't? It's clearly not the pull factor. I can't explain why politicians are such cowards, but it is cowardice. And it is also the creation of a subclass of worker, right?
Yes. Yeah, I was about to get to that, because what we're seeing is, many of them are working, but they're obviously not working legally, and obviously that means that they're not paying taxes, so they're not contributing, and also they don't have the protections that a normal employee would have. So I think there's been a bit of a case about it regarding delivery riders, where the right wing are like, we need to clamp down on the delivery riders because they're stealing people's jobs. But these jobs are obviously available. But it seems to be the case, and I'm not fully up on it, but it seems to be the case that people who have contracts with these companies are, putting out to
Renting out their
tender.
accounts,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
Sorry, say again.
So they're essentially sort of renting out their
Yeah.
accounts to people who can't make an account because they don't have the right.
But obviously, those people who are doing the actual work don't have any protections. They don't have any. They're not paying taxes. It's and if they have an accident or something like that, it's probably a disaster for both them and for whoever's renting out the contract.
And this is, it's discussing it in so many. I mean, first of all, that point about workplace safety is really, really important. You see this all the time. I mean, another area is construction work, or like restaurant work, construction work. If you are an undocumented worker, an asylum seeker, and you don't have the protections, it's an extremely dangerous area of work. I mean, like a lot of these areas of work where people are concentrated who don't have the right to work and are therefore excluded from protections are dangerous areas of work. And we see people, there was this recent story of this Albanian young man who fell to his death off a scaffold because his employer, who was a construction worker, had just simply not put up the appropriate workplace protections. And people die, people are exploited, people are underpaid, and people literally die without any protection when they're working under these circumstances. But I would also say, like, we're talking about gig economy workers right now, and we're talking about delivery drivers. It's an easily demonizable section of the workforce. But I think it's really interesting because this is not a new issue, right? We've known in this sector, we've known that people without the right to work very often work in gig economy spaces. We've known that for as long as the gig economy's been in place, right? It's an obvious weak spot in terms of how well you can regulate the system. And before the election, the Labour leadership had private meetings in Downing Street with all of the CEOs of these gig economy companies, Deliveroo and so on, in order to obviously have some kind of lobbying and deal making about, well, if you get into power, what are you going to do for us, these big, powerful companies? And we didn't have any discussion then about how they were going to better regulate the safety of their employees and ensure that people were not, if that's what you want to achieve, were not able to work for them who didn't have the authorization to work. No conversation then, because this is not about taxing the massive profits that are made by those companies. This is about having a scapegoat. First of all, giving those companies an endless supply of people who are in such dire straits that they will work for them, even though they have no protection over their income and so on. And also creating a scapegoat, creating somebody that you can point to and say, well, look, these people are working without proper registration, without proper paperwork. They're the problem. And that's an explanation for why the government has no money, which is obviously completely absurd. Because the reason the government has no money is because it's not taxing massive companies like Deliveroo.
It was quite interesting when I saw one of the clips, I think it was from GB News, where they were, it was actually footage from the Home Office, but they were arresting the Deliveroo riders. They were not actually arresting the CEOs, which is a little bit strange, because you would imagine in a situation who's committing the crime. Well, the crime is obviously being committed by the company because they're not employing their staff correctly.
And it's just never going to end. I mean, just to be really clear, because what is presented as the solution by these right-wing news organizations and by the government as well is that we'll arrest the worker. And if you arrest the worker, if you deport the worker, which you probably can't do if they're an asylum seeker, but anyway, what happens next? There is another person who is in the exact same system who will take that job. And so unless your solution, there are solutions, and we need solutions to undocumented work. It is a real problem. People get exploited. People are harmed by this system, and it's not good for our economy. We need solutions to it. They have to be systemic solutions. As long as you keep going after the people who are the victims at the very bottom of the chain, then another person will come through that system, and another person will come through that system, and you create, it's a doom loop. It will never end unless you actually address, why are people having to take on these jobs? Nobody wants to work without the protection of the state.
I just want to read some comments. There's a lot of comments here, but I won't be able to read all of them, but I'll just pick out a few. Zoe's delivery is excellent, so informative. That's from Harry. You have a lot of fans on tonight. somebody was saying, can they work as are they employed as self-employed? Sorry, the comment, and then I lost the comment there. Somebody was asking about self-employed. Are these people working as self-employed? Well, I don't think so. Are they?
It's a gray area in the gig economy. So it's like, you know, the big companies classify you as self-employed in terms of like whether they need to give you benefits, and this is for all workers, right? Not just the ones who are asylum seekers. And it means that they don't have to give the same rights to sick pay, holiday pay, and so on. But in actual fact, you know, the reality experienced by the people who are working for these companies is that they are employees in that sense. So it's a gray area in the law, and it's somewhere where we should have better regulation. But yeah, I mean, that regulation would help everybody. It would help migrants and locals who are working these jobs. And these jobs are like, you know, treated like we don't need them. But I mean, we clearly do.
They're being done. Yes, because, you know, it's obviously they're being done because somebody's
ordering a pizza.
Exactly. But, you know, once again, if there was proper measures put in place, then these people, if they were allowed to work, they would be able to get a decent contract, get decent protections, and they would be paying their taxes. They would be contributing.
And they might work in other areas as well, because, like, you know, I'm not going to, you know, it's important not to pretend that everybody who comes here seeking asylum has had a high-class education or whatever. In many cases, these are people from the poorest and most disadvantaged backgrounds in the world. In many cases, they're not. In many cases, they are highly educated. In many places, they have had professions in the places where they've come from, and being kept out of the labor market, you know, they could do all sorts of things in our economy. And the potential that people have is being squeezed out of them by this horrific system that keeps them in this forced inactivity for such a long time.
I just want to say thanks to Cavan Ladd for that support. One of the comments we constantly hear from Richard Tice and Reform UK is about stopping the boat. So this thing of, I bang my head against the desk because you even more so when I keep hearing about how we need to send the boats back. So, and they refer to Australia. So in Australia, it happened a number of years ago where the situation is completely different, obviously, but they were talking about pushing the boats back or sending people back. Why would that not work in the English Channel? Why would it not be possible to send the boats back? Not just asking this just for your opinion on it, because obviously I think we both agree that it's dangerous.
It's a morally bad idea anyway. But like, practically speaking, so anybody who is telling you that the UK is like Australia, really, like, you should be
look at a map.
I mean, there are some fundamental differences, and Australia is indescribably much more remote and difficult to reach by sea than the UK is. So that's the first thing. Secondly, Australia's relationship to its closest neighbours, which was in this case Indonesia, was the key point of departure, is totally asymmetrical in terms of power. You compare us to France and Australia to Indonesia, we are not talking about the same geopolitical relationships. So Australia was able to essentially bribe and bully. I mean, that's how I would describe it. I'm sure others would say, you know, use geopolitical might and diplomacy or whatever. Yes. But essentially, they managed to get the Indonesian government to accept that they would be returning those boats. The French have very little reason to accept that unless we offer something in return. So in terms of Australia versus Indonesia, it was easy. Australia has big financial power versus Indonesia. Us versus France, we need to offer something much more meaningful. And that should mean offering safe alternative ways for people to travel to the UK, a recognition essentially that France is not responsible for all the refugees. We have to take our fair share, and we can take them through safe routes. And if we were to do that, then that would enable a conversation with the French that might say that they would accept returned refugees as well. But until we're ready to have that conversation, then it ain't gonna happen.
I just want to, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I'm going to let you go in just a moment. But I just want to ask one final thing. We've heard a lot over the last number of years about setting up a processing center in France. So I don't know if the French government are still on board with such an idea. Would that be a solution, or would it just be in a sense, trying to create a situation, trying to move the problem. I don't like to use the term problem, but move the problem somewhere else. Would it be a viable solution, or should it be something just ignored and create proper safe routes to Britain?
So I'm really glad you asked this, because I think a lot of people who are, in the right place think that seems like an obvious solution. There's a lot of reasons why it's not actually as good of a solution as it initially sounds. It kind of depends what you mean, obviously, by processing claims in France. If what you mean is a really, really light touch system, like what we had for Ukrainians across the whole of Europe were able to apply basically for a travel document. They gave very, very minimal documentation. They applied for a travel document, and that allowed them to travel legally and safely to the UK. Yes, we should do that. That would make a lot of sense, and that would enable people to just bypass the smugglers, come here on the ferry or on the Eurostar, just like you or I would, and then submit a claim for asylum. That would be brilliant. If what you mean is, we should process their claims over there, it becomes really, really complicated and quite ugly really quickly. So essentially, that asylum system that I described, when you're having to work out what somebody has fled from, where has somebody come from, all of that happening within our own country is very hard to monitor the conditions that people live in, the standard of the interviews and the quality of decision making that they are having. As I said, people go through appeals processes. They need access to the advice of lawyers. It is a complex procedure. You take that and you put it overseas. At the very, very minimum, what you're talking about is a massive increase in cost, massive increase in cost, because you have to send all of that process over there. And then, obviously the ability to monitor the human rights situation, the fact that whether people are getting the adequate representation, all of that is made incredibly much more difficult when it's happening overseas. So it's a non-starter in terms of running our asylum system in France. Also, the French, like, realistically speaking, it has come up and different, sort of suggest, but that option of us just running our asylum system in France, they would never agree to that. There's no prospect of that, but obviously, because where's the advantage for them? So I think a really light touch system where you can obtain travel documentation from France or from other places in Europe is a really smart idea. But a system where we try to offload our responsibility to refugees to process them elsewhere is just immediately fraught with huge difficulties and massive costs, and it's just a total non-starter.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for speaking with me this evening. It was really informative, and I think it was really informative for so many people online. What I'll do is after this video has gone up, I'll post some links to yourself and to promote it on social media, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much for speaking with me tonight, Zoe.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to be